Ever get the feeling that certain political issues gain momentum, not because they're really the most critical problems, but because they benefit certain politicians?
Oh, absolutely.
Well, that's what we're diving into today, this idea of political entrepreneurship.
Fascinating stuff.
It is, think of it as politicians using issues for their own gain, not necessarily out of actual concern.
It's all about strategy and power.
Exactly. And to really understand how this works, we're going to unpack a specific historical case.
Okay.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Now, this act, which barred Chinese immigration and denied citizenship to those already in the U.S.,
Right.
this wasn't just some random act of prejudice.
No.
There was a calculated political strategy at play.
It's crucial to remember the context.
Okay.
Post-Civil War America. The Democrats are struggling to gain ground against the dominant Republican Party. And California, a crucial swing state at the time, becomes a key battleground for this political maneuvering.
Okay, so set the stage for me. What was it about the Chinese community that made them such a target for this kind of political strategy?
Well, they were already vulnerable, you see.
Okay.
The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't the starting point of discrimination.
Right.
The 1790 Naturalization Act had already prevented them from becoming citizens or voting.
Wow.
Imagine being in a new country and denied basic rights like that.
Yeah.
It made them easy scapegoats because they couldn't fight back politically.
So the Democrats saw this opportunity to exploit that vulnerability.
Precisely. They started pushing this narrative, often through the media portraying Chinese immigrants as this threat to American jobs and wages, even our culture. Imagine yourself in California back then. You're seeing these messages in newspapers, hearing politicians blaming Chinese immigrants for your economic troubles.
Yeah.
It's easy to see how this kind of rhetoric could take hold.
But wouldn't the Republicans have had their own economic arguments to counter the Democrats? How did they let this anti-Chinese rhetoric take hold?
There was some initial hesitation, maybe for moral reasons or concerns about public image. But politics can be ruthless.
For sure.
No one wants to lose a crucial state like California.
Yeah.
And the research by economists Vincent Geloso and Linan Peng really highlights this.
Okay, I'm all ears. What did their research actually reveal?
Well, they analyzed county-level election results in California between 1868 and 1880.
Okay.
And they found something really interesting.
Okay, what was it?
They found a clear pattern. The more Chinese people lived in a county, the tighter the election race became.
Really?
It really shows you how effective this strategy of scapegoating was. The Democrats were gaining traction by using the Chinese as a wedge issue.
So the Democrats are successfully demonizing the Chinese for political gain. What were the Republicans doing during all this? They weren't just sitting back and watching this happen, were they?
At first, maybe.
Yeah.
But by the late 1870s, even they caved to the pressure.
Really?
The research shows they started adopting similar anti-Chinese rhetoric and policies. It seems that winning took precedence over everything else.
So both major parties are now on the same page. Anti-Chinese sentiment becomes politically advantageous.
Right.
It's no wonder the Exclusion Act passed with such overwhelming support.
Exactly. It really highlights how this bipartisan agreement, driven by political expediency rather than genuine concern, made the Exclusion Act almost inevitable.
It's a perfect example of how a vulnerable group can be exploited when they lack the political power to defend themselves.
Absolutely.
What's fascinating is that the Democrats weren't creating this anti-Chinese sentiment out of thin air.
No.
They were tapping into existing economic anxieties and social prejudices that were already simmering in California.
Right.
It's a reminder that political entrepreneurship often works by exploiting pre-existing vulnerabilities and fears.
It's about recognizing those anxieties and leveraging them to achieve a specific political goal. And in this case, that goal was to secure votes and win elections.
Now, you mentioned Geloso and Peng's research a couple of times now. What exactly did they use to make these connections? How did they get this data?
Well, they used census data from 1870 and 1880,
Okay.
which included variables like the ratio of Chinese to white population in each county, population size, manufacturing wages, and the ratio of the manufacturing to farming sectors. They matched these variables with election results from the closest election year.
So they were very thorough in ensuring their data was accurate and could be used to draw conclusions about political strategies and election outcomes.
Yes, and they were looking specifically at presidential elections because a president's veto could potentially block anti-Chinese legislation.
Oh, interesting.
So that allowed them to focus on this particular issue.
This negative correlation, what does that tell us about the political landscape at the time?
Well, it highlights how the Democrats successfully exploited pre-existing anxieties by making Chinese immigrants the scapegoats for economic hardship.
Right.
As their strategy gained traction, it created this political pressure cooker where even the Republicans felt compelled to adopt similar stances.
It's almost like they created this self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they talked about the Chinese being a threat, the more people started to believe it and the more politically advantageous it became to be anti-Chinese.
Exactly, a vicious cycle.
It is. Let's dig into that vicious cycle in more detail.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through how Geloso and Peng's research actually proved this connection between the political maneuvering and the eventual passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act?
Sure, so their hypothesis was that if the Democrats were using this anti-Chinese sentiment as a political strategy, then counties with a higher ratio of Chinese residents to white residents should be more politically competitive.
Okay.
And they measured this competitiveness by looking at the margin of victory between the Republican and Democratic candidates in each county.
So the smaller the gap between those votes,
Exactly.
the more competitive that county would be.
Precisely. And their analysis actually supported this prediction. They found that as the Chinese population in a county increased, the election results got closer,
Interesting.
which suggests that the Democrat strategy of using anti-Chinese rhetoric was resonating with voters, particularly in those areas.
So their data actually backs up the idea that a larger Chinese population made those counties more of a battleground for both parties.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. As the Republicans started to adopt their own anti-Chinese policies, that correlation started to diminish.
No, really?
By the 1880 election, the impact of the Chinese population on the margin of victory had become almost statistically insignificant.
Wow, so it's like the more both parties jumped on that anti-Chinese bandwagon,
Right.
the less of a unique advantage it provided. It became the norm, not a distinguishing factor.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It seems that winning took precedence over principles, and the Chinese community became a casualty of this political game.
You know, this whole situation feels eerily familiar. The strategy of using a marginalized group as a scapegoat for complex problems.
Yeah.
It's something we still see today, wouldn't you say?
It's a timeless tactic, unfortunately. It's about simplifying complex issues and finding someone to blame. And often it's the groups who lack political power or representation who become the easiest targets.
It's a sobering reminder that we need to be critical thinkers and not just accept everything we hear, especially when it comes to how certain groups are being portrayed in the media or by politicians.
Absolutely. We need to ask ourselves who benefits from this narrative. What are the underlying motives at play here?
So we've talked about how this political entrepreneurship played out in the lead up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. But what does this all mean for us today? What are the long-term consequences we should be thinking about?
Well, for one, it's a stark reminder that politicians, regardless of party affiliation, can and will exploit societal fears and divisions for their own benefit. And unfortunately, as we've discussed, this pattern isn't limited to the past.
It's like that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. But in this case, the crisis was manufactured for political gain. It makes you wonder what crises are being manufactured today for similar purposes.
That's a great point. And this brings us back to the importance of critical thinking. We need to be aware of how certain groups can be scapegoated for political purposes, just like the Chinese community was back then. Think about how immigrants, minorities, or other marginalized communities are often portrayed in political discourse.
It's easy to draw parallels, isn't it? The language might be different, but the tactics often feel eerily familiar.
The key takeaway is that we need to be vigilant. We need to question the narratives we're being fed, especially when it comes to groups that lack political power or influence. We need to look beyond the surface and ask ourselves who is being silenced, who's being misrepresented, and who benefits from this manipulation.
So while the Chinese Exclusion Act might feel like a distant historical event, its legacy and the political maneuvering that led to it continues to have relevance today.
Without a doubt, it's a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked political opportunism. We need to be wary of those who seek to divide us for their own gain.
The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't just a temporary policy. It remained in effect until 1943, and its legacy continues to shape discussions on immigration and racial justice even today. Imagine the lasting impact this act had not just on the Chinese community, but on the very fabric of American society.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? This act wasn't just about immigration. It was about who gets to belong, who gets to be considered American. And that's a question that we're still grappling with today.
It's chilling to think about the long-term consequences of political decisions that are driven by fear and expediency rather than justice and compassion.
It's a reminder that the choices we make, the narratives we buy into, can have ripple effects that extend far beyond our immediate present.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the political strategy behind the Chinese Exclusion Act, what's the one thing you want our listener to really take away from this conversation?
I think the most crucial point is this. Be wary of political entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
When politicians try to rally support by targeting a specific group, especially a vulnerable one, ask yourself, is this genuine concern or is something else at play?
It's like a red flag, right? Whenever we hear a politician demonizing a particular group, we should always be skeptical of their motives.
Exactly.
Okay.
And remember, this dynamic can manifest in countless ways. It might not always be as overt as the Chinese Exclusion Act, but the underlying principle remains the same. Look for those who benefit from division and fear.
So as we navigate the complexities of today's political landscape, let's all channel our inner Geloso and Peng. Let's be critical thinkers, examine the evidence, and be wary of those who seek to divide us for their own gain.
I love that idea. Let's not let history repeat itself.
Because history has shown us time and again that when we allow fear and prejudice to guide our political decisions, the consequences can be devastating and far-reaching.
And the echoes of those decisions can reverberate for generations to come.
So that wraps up our deep dive into the political strategy behind the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've unpacked a lot today, and I hope it's given you, the listener, some food for thought. As always, the best deep dives are those that leave us with more questions than answers.
I couldn't agree more.
And speaking of questions, here's one for you to ponder as you go about your day. Are there any contemporary issues where you see these similar dynamics of political entrepreneurship at play? Think about it. Who are the vulnerable groups being targeted today, and who stands to benefit from that manipulation?
It's a question worth reflecting on, especially as we strive to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
It's a call to action, really.
I think so.
Don't just be a passive observer. Question the narratives, challenge the status quo, and be an advocate for those who are being marginalized or silenced.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping a more just and equitable world.
So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep diving deep, and most importantly, keep using your voice to make a difference.
I can't wait to see what we uncover together next time.
As always, the best deep dives leave us with more questions than answers.
Oh, for sure.
And speaking of questions,
Yeah.
here's one for you to ponder as you go about your day. Are there any issues today where you see these same dynamics of political entrepreneurship happening? Think about it. Who are the vulnerable groups being targeted, and who benefits from that?
That's a really good question. It's definitely something to think about, especially as we try to create a fairer society for everybody.
It's a call to action, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Don't just sit back and watch. Question what you hear, challenge the way things are, and stand up for those who are being marginalized or silenced.
We all have a part to play in building a better world.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep digging deeper, and most importantly, keep speaking up and making a difference.
I can't wait to see what we discover next time on our deep dive.